When I first started reading Water Moon, I did not think that I would be making a review of it. I thought it would just be a quick little read, something to get the month of reading going, a nice little fantasy narrative. We read it, 3 out of 5 most likely, we move on with our life. That didn't really happen because for the next couple of weeks after I finished it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And in no way, shape, or form is it a perfect book, but I think it's important enough and interesting enough that I wanted to sit down and make a full dedicated video about it rather than just kind of a snippet on a monthly recap read. So today I want to go through the book. I want to try and stay as spoiler free as possible. You know, sometimes I get caught in the weeds and these become spoilerish. So just know that going in, sometimes I get carried away. Also, despite my thousands of hours of watching anime, my Japanese pronunciation is not great. So if you'll forgive me that, let us get into Water Moon, the things I liked, the things I didn't like, and the stuff that just makes me think. Let's start at the plot, because when I gave a book report in the 3rd grade, that is where my teacher told me that I should start. You should always give them a plot so that they can have something to hold on to. We follow our main protagonist, Hannah, who lives in a mystical world in which she is about to take over a pawn shop where people from our world come to pawn their regrets. Pretty interesting premise. We are on the precipice of her taking over from her father when she walks downstairs in the pawn shop and realizes her father's missing. There seems to have been a break-in. What the hell is going on? All hell is breaking loose. And just at that moment, Kay, a human from our world, walks into the pawn shop and a mystical adventure takes place. I'm not going to go any further than that. I think that we might be entering into spoiler territory, but just know that they go on your traditional hero's journey, learning about themselves, learning about each other, learning about the world. There's some philosophical discussion about regrets, about, you know, the choices that we make, and are we defined by our choices, or can there be choices we make that then turn into, or choices that we then change? There's some interesting surface level philosophy here. It's not incredibly deep, and there seems to be just a few philosophical discussions that take place. Not super in depth, but a really interesting story nonetheless that has these philosophical elements kind of weaved throughout. If I've piqued your fancy, I would say go and read it because it is pretty short, and as we continue going, I think I'm going to get into a little bit more spoiler territory here. I recommend it. It's not a perfect book like I said earlier, but I think it's good enough that I can solidly recommend it to you. If you're a fantasy fan, if you've read, you know, a lot of Japanese inspired fantasy, if you're familiar with, you know, Japanese mythology, I think you'll enjoy this. It's decently written. There's some solid character moments, so go pick it up. We're gonna dive a little bit deeper into the characters, and as such, we may get into some spoilers. So after the plot, the next best place to go, I think, is to the characters. The characters in this novel are good, but they are not great. We'll start with Hannah, who was a little bit less than what I was looking for. She is a very solid protagonist. She is a very solid guide through her world. I think that through her eyes, we learn a lot of what the world has to offer that she grew up in. And as she kind of guides Kay, the human in the story, through her world and explains a lot of how the world works, we learn a lot about the world as well. So we learn the world building through her eyes, which I think is done very well. It's written very well. She's a solid character. The moments that I don't really love with Hannah, she's obsessed with self-determinism. She's obsessed with these decisions, these choices, which are a central theme throughout the book. And it feels like we never really get past level 1 with that type of stuff. It seems like the same question continues to be asked. She continues to ask it over and over and over again. We never really progress. We never really grow with her. We kind of do towards the end of the book, but it's very haphazard. We end in a good place, obviously, but it's not really earned throughout. We kind of are at one level for 90% of the book, and then the last 10%, we've got a ton of growth, and we end up in the place where we wanted to. I would have liked to have seen more of a smoother kind of character growth arc, but that's just me personally. I thought she was a good character, not a great character. I'm not a huge fan of the reluctant quest goer. I think this is a trope that either you enjoy and you seek these out and you want to put yourself in the shoes of, well, what choice would I make if I was presented with this, you know, mystical quest? Would I be excited? Or would I be more of a reluctant, you know, great power being thrust upon me or great responsibility being thrust upon me? I don't love that. It's not one of my favorite tropes in the fantasy genre. And she just never seems to break out of her reluctance. I'm okay if it's like the beginning of the quest, we have this reluctance, but then we kind of get to a place where we accept the mantle of responsibility for this quest and we evolve kind of past that. But for me, it just seemed like she was always reluctant, always like, oh, I shouldn't, I should be back in the pawn shop. I really shouldn't be doing this. And I get that to a certain degree, but for me personally, it didn't really work. Our second main character is Kay. He's the human in this story. He's a good foil to Hannah in that he's a little bit more pie in the sky, a little bit more of a dreamer, not so much grounded in like the realities of his situation. But that is kind of because he's trying to run away from things. So that it's an interesting characterization. A lot of his dialogue and a lot of her dialogue is juvenile, is very like 8th grade love story type. And he says a lot of those cringeworthy dialogue lines, so that can kind of leave a sour taste in your mouth. But overall, I think his arc is a little bit stronger than Hannah's. The position in which he finds himself at the end of the book feels a little bit more fleshed out to me. So both are good characters, but neither of them kind of transcend the level of just your basic protagonists in a B+ fantasy novel. So far you may be asking yourself, why the heck are you making this review video if you didn't really seem to love the book? Well, we are reaching the part of the book that I loved, and that is the world building and the locations and the mystical nature of this book. It is so well described, it's so well thought out, it's so well imagined. It leans heavily on Japanese mythology, but never to a point where if you don't have any basis of understanding for Japanese mythology, it's going to go all completely over your head, because it is explained through our character's eyes very, very well. I really, really enjoyed the world building in this. I thought it was pretty fantastic. It was one of the reasons that I enjoyed this book as much as I did. The world can only carry us so far, and I wish that more of the plot points in each individual location were a little bit stronger, but just being in those places, being in the massive libraries, in the different, the marketplaces. I'm trying to be as vague as possible to not spoil it. It's very, very interesting. So if you are a fan of solid world building with a Japanese kind of mythology inspired bent to it, I think you'll really, really love this. It was probably my favorite part of the book, and one of the reasons why I can't stop thinking about it is I keep thinking about locations, and I keep thinking about different things that may have happened in each location in the day-to-day life outside of the plot line of the book, which I think is a really, really solid indicator of good world building. Does the world itself, do the individual locations kind of build their own structure where you can ask yourself, does this feel lived in? Does this feel like it's just a place for characters to come and perform actions, or is this an actual place that you could see life being lived? And I think that it's written in a way in which you can, outside of the main plot of the story. We also get a pretty decent amount of the real world, Kay's world, the world in which he lives and inhabits his life. And I think those two kind of parallel running juxtapositions really helps as well, because we get the mundane real world with Kay in a couple scenes where we see him, just being a professor and working through scientific problems. And then those scientific problems then get flipped on their head in the mystical world that Hannah inhabits. And I thought that was a really interesting touch to keep us excited about the next phase of the exploration, because we would kind of get a setup with something with Kay, and then we would get it paid off with something with Hannah in the mystical world. And I just thought, that tip my hat to that writing style. I thought that was really interesting. Those parallel worlds kind of running together, kind of jumping back and forth between the laws of nature, physics, all that stuff, I think helped really ground you into what our world is and how mystical and exciting this world is. Tonally, like I said, this is an interesting one because it is trying to ask philosophical questions. It is trying to ask existential questions, questions about regret, questions about decision making, but it never really goes below like a surface level discussion. And at its core, I think that that's fine because it is a fantasy novel at the end of the day. It's not a philosophical textbook. And going into it, I think if it had delved deeper into the philosophical text, aspect, I think I would not have enjoyed it as much. Maybe if I had known that it was more philosophical going into it, I would have, but that's an argument of expectations more so than anything else. Going in expecting a fantasy novel with just a light sprinkling of philosophy, of existentialism, of decision making is probably the best way to approach this book, because you're not going to get anything surface level, and at a certain point it starts to become pretty repetitive. But I think for a fantasy novel that works tonally. I don't really want to get super bogged down. It's not a dark fantasy. It's a light, airy kind of fairy tale fantasy. And that to me indicates tonally that we don't need to be diving as deep into these questions. These questions can be asked, the reader can answer them, but the author really shouldn't be kind of utilizing full chapters to get us into the philosophical text. It's weaved in well. That's all it needs to be. A couple miscellaneous things that I wanted to talk about. Obviously, the Murakami of it all is how I've kind of, defined it. Maybe I'm doing Murakami a disservice, or maybe I'm doing the author, Samantha Soto Yambao, a disservice by comparing the two. But I just, whenever you run across magical realism with a bent of any type of Japanese culture or mythology, my mind goes to Murakami. Maybe I need to evolve past that. But when we're talking about giants in that vein, it's hard not to make those comparisons for me personally. I felt like this does have some Murakami influence in it, but it doesn't lean on it at all. And it also diverges from Murakami's work pretty substantially. One way, big spoiler alert, is that the ending is happy. The ending is not ambiguous. The ending is not, they get together. It happily ever after. And that, for me, didn't really work. I thought going through it, and with all of the discussions about making choices and sticking to your choices and living the life that you are supposed to live or that would work best for you, that it would be a tryst. They would be lovers for a few months and then move away, and they would have the bittersweet memories of the time that they had together, but that they wouldn't ultimately end up with each other. And in the last 10 to 15 pages, all that gets thrown on its head, and that just fell very flat for me. I think because as I'm reading it, I'm trying to think that this is a Murakami novel when it's not. So that's not fair to the author, but that's the personal baggage that I am bringing in to this review. It is not a Murakami book, and I needed to realize that, but I didn't. So there you go. I think that there are definitely some similarities. There are ways in which you can see Murakami in this, but specifically with character, I think Hannah's characterization, Murakami, God love him, doesn't really have the best female characterization in a lot of his works. And his male protagonists are also a little bit, kind of, for lack of a better, like aimless. And I think that both protagonists in this book had more structure to them. That worked for what it was. Also, just the lack of ambivalence, the lack of reader's intention. This book, from plot point A to plot point B to the end, is written out, the author wants us to follow, whereas Murakami kind of gives you these little moments where you as the reader can kind of read into a specific thing or not. Those are just some of my random thoughts about the Murakami of it all. I love Murakami's works, and I really enjoyed a lot of this book, and that's where my mind was going. A couple things I didn't like, because like I said, it's not a perfect book. I think 3.5 out of 5 for me, maybe a 4 if I'm feeling very generous and I lean into the world building, but I think 3.5 is probably a good place to leave it. I did not like the dialogue in a lot of cases. I think the dialogue between Hannah and her father was really strong. Basically, I didn't like the dialogue between Hannah and Kay. Like I talked about earlier, the romance between those two felt very juvenile, felt very 8th grade, but it kind of works for what the story is. But a lot of moments in the dialogue just kind of made me cringe. The second thing, it does feel like it takes a little bit too long to get where we're going. And then when we get there, it's kind of like an avalanche and then you're done. So like I talked about earlier, 80% of the book, we're kind of meandering through this world. We're learning new things about the world. We're sort of going on the quest. We're sort of remaining in the plot. And then the final 20% of the book are like, oh, we need an ending. Let's, tie this up, tie this up, tie this up. We're done. So, maybe it could have been paced a little bit better. But again, I think it's a 400-page book. I think, if we had paced it a little bit better, maybe it extends a little bit too long. I don't know the ins and outs of publishing and all that. But that was just something. It drags a little bit in the beginning and it rushes quite a bit in the end, and that could probably set a couple people off. And then lastly, I touched on it a little bit, I like a little bit more ambiguity in my endings, I like a little bit more ambiguity in my plots. I just like the ability to kind of read into things a little bit more. I think this comes from I really like, underground filmmaking, and I like to, as a consumer of media, place myself in that media and kind of come to my own conclusions in a lot of cases. That's not to say I don't like a story that kind of writes it out for you. And in the fantasy genre, I think most of the time getting a conclusive ending is probably the right way to go. But personally, I just felt like maybe the ending fell flat a little bit for me, or I was looking for more of a bittersweet type of ending. It just didn't really hit, which knocked it down a few points. But like I said, those are my thoughts. Watermoon, I think it's worth reading. I really do. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts. If you've read this book, if you want to read this book, what did you think about it? Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Hopefully I articulated myself well. Go check this book out. If you're interested in more book reviews, we've got a ton on the channel. We've got tier lists. We're reading 100 books this year, so you should probably subscribe so you can keep up with that. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you soon.